I got the impression they were not as poor as many of the immigrants. The descending order of the children is in the book. There's Annie, who we called Chaya, Fanny, Sarah, my mother, Charlie, who married his cousin Tilly, Esther, Joe, and Sam. I believe there was also a cousin that came with them, a cousin from my grandfather's side. And then we got into all this interesting stuff about whether my grandmother and my grandfather were cousins, because there's a big interconnection between the two sides of the family, and we're trying to sort that out as we go along. Okay, I used to question my mother about the old country. She remembered her grandmother, who I assume was her maternal grandmother, Esther Londinsky. She said she was a small, red-headed woman who did not wear a wig, which most of the pious women did, and that she wore very beautiful clothes that came from Europe, that is, not Poland. That's the kind of thing my mother would remember, because she liked clothes. I mean, not that she could afford to buy nice clothes. She made everything, and she made all of our clothes, and she was a wonderful seamstress also. She said that her father built roads. She said he was an engineer. Well, I think that was not exactly what it was, but a civil engineer, but he was, that's the word she used. She said that they built roads, and they lived part of the time in another town, Londinsky, am I saying it right? I wonder if this jives with information from other members of the family, and it seems to. Now, I don't know if it was only Abraham and his father who was in the who lived in Londinsky, or if it was my mother's, if it was Esther and Shmuel that lived in both places. But this whole thing about living in both places and the stonemason seems to go together. In St. Louis, now I can't tell you any more about anything beyond that because my grandparents died young, and I don't know any other back history of that. But in St. Louis, my grandfather sold leather and other supplies to shoemakers. He wasn't a shoemaker, but he sold leather bindings. They had a horse and wagon, and Charlie helped him at first. And then Tilly came, and they got married. They came to the United States in 1909 based on the fact that my mother was about 10 years old. At first they lived downtown where the Jewish neighborhood was at the time. Later my grandparents bought a two-family house in a more integrated neighborhood farther west. Two of the older sisters, Annie and Fanny, were teenagers, and they went to work. Annie being Chaya and Fanny went to work. My mother was supposed to go to school when the fall semester started. Meantime, she was sent to work for a milliner. By the time fall came, her co-workers were discouraging her from going to school. They said that she was going to be 11 years old, and they told her that the kids that they'd make fun of her in school and that they'd put her in kindergarten. So instead, she went to work in the garment district. Contrary to what you hear about sweatshops, she liked the work, and she always regretted not going to school. She went to night school and learned to read, but she always felt that not going to school was the worst decision she ever made. The four younger siblings all had good educations. The two youngest attended college. Joe got a PhD, and we have assumed that he was on the Manhattan Project. He was a dean of a university, I think, in Arkansas. And Sam was an MA in social work. My father, Max, came from Winnipeg to visit some family and met my mother, and they married in 1922 and lived in the same neighborhood as Stinka and Avram. Selma was born the next year, and I followed 4 years later. I'm named after Liba, who was Liba Londinsky, who died young, Beryl Lay's daughter. Okay, when I was about 5 years old, my grandmother developed cancer of the larynx, and our family moved into the grandparents' downstairs flat so my mother could take care of her mother. My childhood memories begin in my grandmother's house, where I lived when I was about 5 to 10 years old. My grandfather, Avram, had already died when our family moved there. The youngest children, Esther, Joe, and Sam, still lived upstairs. I was 6 years old when my grandmother died, and I don't remember much about the upstairs household. This is the only image I retain of my grandmother. She's sitting on a chair in the kitchen. There are cushions behind her, and her feet are on a little step stool. I'm holding a shoe hook and struggling to button her shoes. That's all I remember. I wish I remembered more about her. When I first saw a picture of Whistler's mother, I said, that's it. That's the scene I remember of my grandmother. So now I don't know if it's my Yiddish grandmother I see in the chair or if it's Whistler's grandmother. But every time I see that picture, I think of my grandmother in the chair.